Okay, hi everyone. I'm Tracey Lien, and I'm a technology reporter with the Los Angeles Times. And we're here today. Our panel it comes in two parts. The first is about privacy and security when it comes to neurogaming, and then the second part is about efficacy standards. So I'll let the panel introduce themselves. We'll start with Ariel.
Sure. Hello, my name is Ariel Garten. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Interaxon. We make Muse, the brain-sensing headband. Probably most of you have heard of it. Clinical-grade EEG in this slim little form factor, tracks your brain activity in real time. There's an open platform for developers to build on top of. We also make our own consumer application, which is a meditation tool. Tens of thousands of people use it every day to improve their attention, decrease their stress, and improve their life.
I'm Eddie Martucci. I'm a founder of Akili Interactive, where we make cognitive assessments and cognitive therapeutics that are medical grade but built as action video games. You might have heard yesterday, our science comes from the lab of Adam Ghazali and his interference training, and we have about 9 ongoing clinical studies in a variety of neurocognitive populations.
Hi, I'm Jason Maringer. I'm the Vice President of PsyberGuide. We're looking to be kind of a consumer reports for apps, neurogames, potentially neurowearables in the future, so really excited to be here today.
Hi, my name is John Reppas. I'm the Director of Public Policy for the Neurotechnology Industry Organization, and we're a trade group that's focused on brain-facing technologies.
Hi, I'm Cori, Lathan. I'm founder and CEO of AnthroTronix. We're an R&D company, and we recently developed a brain and behavioral health mobile platform for the military to look at concussion, depression, PTSD, and we received FDA clearance in the fall.
So when we're looking at something like privacy, I mean, everyone is concerned with privacy when it comes to like social media, with their bank accounts. So when it comes to neurogaming, is there anything unique to neurogaming that developers and consumers should be aware of? John, do you want to start?
Well, I'll take one end of the spectrum, and I would say that I wouldn't rush to put this category of data into a special bucket as far as privacy and security. I think that there's lots of concerns, as you say, around both the consumer side as well as the healthcare side, and I don't think there's a lot yet that we've seen that really differentiates data that originates from these types of neurotechnologies in an important way. I'd also say that as we have these discussions, and certainly these discussions are ongoing, as you know, I really would push back against any effort to put these types of data in a separate category because of the shadow it might cast over neurotechnology innovation. I think we're at an early stage, and I don't think it would be helpful. But that's just my view.
I generally agree with that. I mean, I think it's data, and it's important data, and we know that. But I think as soon as we start to label it as possibly more controversial in any way, that can lead to something negative. That said, we want to treat it as important data, which would mean the same types of standards we would put in place for any other types of physiological data we're collecting. I think right now, the amount of physiological data we tend to collect is actually much less for the brain than we do for other parts of the body. But as long as we think about it as data, just like any other parts of the body, then that's probably the bucket we want it to go in.
So what can currently be extracted from data read from like the Muse headset or like any EEG headset?
So the basic things that you can get out of EEG, it's very easy to get state data. Are you focused? Are you relaxed? Are you excited? Some affect data. Are you sad, happy? We can get event-related data. Did something at this moment catch your attention? Or at this moment, did you feel like there's an error, ERNs or P300s? We can't yet see what's going on inside your head in a specific way. We can't detect your thoughts. Over time, we hope the technology is going to get better and better, and we will become better at resolving particular states of mind and resolving particular things that were salient to you. We also hope that we'll get better and better at resolving disease states. So some of the things that we have to look in this brain data are neuromarkers for disease. Already, ADHD has a neuromarker that has been validated by the FDA. So when we look at the kind of brain data that we can extract, I think we need to both be creating standards for today and thinking about today's data, as well as future-proofing, because we're going to get more complex in our understanding, which is going to be really helpful for everybody if we do it in the right way.
And so what are some of the standards that developers today should start, I guess, incorporating into their privacy measures when we're looking at the kinds of data that can be collected today and the kinds of data that can be collected in the future?
I'll take that. So one of the things that is basic and fundamental to us at Interaxon is everybody owns their own brain data. So brain data has to be governed by the consumer, and they have the right to pull it off your server. They have the right to do whatever they want with it. All terms of service have to be written in plain English, and everyone has to consent. Nobody's agency can ever be reduced. And actually, for this question of standards, we've created a body, the Center for Responsible Brainwave Technologies, which is an industry-wide organization that is actually creating a set of standards for the industry so that developers don't need to ask this question, what should I do to keep people's data safe? There's really easy steps that you can follow to basically come up to something close to HIPAA compliance so that everybody's privacy is really clear.
I think you can actually get HIPAA compliance as opposed to close to it, but I agree.
Yeah, we are HIPAA compliant with all of our data, not because we're supposed to be, but because it's the right thing to do.
You need to be, yeah. And I love the idea of people owning their own data. I think that's critical. And so the types of standards you can put in place are, if you think of the medical analogy, and this is a debate that's far outside this room, but owning your own medical data. But because we're so early on in this field and because there's so much we want to do with the data we're collecting, I think there's a second type of data analyses that need to be, have standards put in place and need to be protected, which are anonymized and aggregated data. Because we're getting so much from EEG sensors, we're getting so much from gameplay that's, some of it's cognitive, some of it's not. It's total behavioral gameplay compliance data. But the world needs to understand where the signals are coming from. And so I think there are mechanisms for these. For medical data, there's mechanisms that the games industry have for anonymizing data, but be able to aggregate and analyze that. And I think applying both of those filters is probably very critical in allowing this field to grow.
Do you think this standard has to be applied to both the developer making a neuro game that's for like just fun purposes, so something like a throw trucks with your mind game, and does that have to also apply to, like, say, someone using a neuro game for clinical purposes? Like, should it be the same standard across the board?
I think there needs to be a basic set of standards that everybody complies with. People making fun games are fantastic, and then they go out into the public, so you need to make sure that these games, when they enter into the public sphere, do no harm across 5 measures: privacy, security, agency, efficacy, and transparency. And so everybody's creating things that meet a base level of these standards so that we can grow as an industry. Because if you have one bad actor, that then becomes a press release that goes out to the world, where it's really easy to act ethically in the space, and we all have to do so. And we all have to just agree to come together and say, yes, there are basics that we will set. Us as the big game headset developers and big platform developers, can create tools that we can give to our developers that meet these standards so that everybody down the chain, without having to worry about it or think deeply about it, will be acting in a way that is ethical and up to a base level of standards.
So speaking of standards, what about efficacy standards? Jason, this might be a good question for you to answer. Is there currently an industry standard for neurogaming or like sort of therapeutic neurogaming?
I don't think one exists at least in the consumer consciousness. I've been very impressed coming here, speaking to some of my colleagues, some of my hopefully future colleagues, about where the field is going in terms of efficacy standards. So there's interest in the involvement with the FDA. What I haven't heard is the industry itself coming together to maybe create some efficacy standards. We all know that going the FDA route can be time-consuming, expensive. And if there's a way to integrate that sort of high-level, consumer-trusted, consumer-understood standard with maybe another pipeline or another pathway or something that can be attained earlier in the development of the product, I think that's going to do wonders for making sure that good quality products are getting out to consumers in a timely fashion.
Not to beat a dead horse, but that is the SARB standard. FDA is a really high bar and an amazing one to meet, but you don't actually need to meet an FDA bar to bring something out to consumers, so long as we all agree that we've done something that's right as a group, there's sufficient scientific validation behind the principles to what you're making. We can all say, okay, we've all agreed, go forward.
Yeah, there's really 3 tiers. I mean, there's the tier of we want to put something out that's for consumers and is more in the fun camp and the fun and interest camp, and maybe there don't need to be efficacy standards at all for that because people aren't looking for anything that would be efficacy. There's sort of the tier above that, as you alluded to, which is something that's more in the consumer sphere, is not looking to make a disease claim. But for that, I think that's the area we're missing right now, is where is the how does someone who's going to buy something that they're not necessarily buying it for the treatment of a disease, they're buying it for some general consumer efficacy. they don't have anywhere to go right now to know what that is. And then you have the tier of FDA, as we're all talking about, and that's, I think, a bit more clear. People understand when it's not easy, and it's long, and it's expensive, but when you get there, it's a bit more clear to consumers, okay, well, this has an FDA stamp on it. So I think it's understanding those tiers, and especially at the tiers that aren't as black and white, that we today don't have anything. So I think this group that's here at this conference is well positioned to start thinking about what something like that would be, and I know Jason's working on that as well.
I think there are a couple other stakeholders too. I think patient advocacy groups or disease advocacy groups have dipped their toe in these waters to some extent in a way that's very selective according to the disease area, so I think that's helpful. I think physicians, for the most part, are going to sit this one out for the time being. We're not seeing big practice societies taking a stand either way on this stuff yet. Not to say that individual physicians aren't excited and engaged around some of these things, but we're not seeing a category level position on this stuff either way, which again I think is to be expected. And finally, payers. I think that that's an important group here, which I think, from my perspective, are the de facto guarantors of quality going forward. Certainly for stuff that's more focused on the therapeutic side. We've seen insurers take a lot of interest in this kind of stuff outside the CNS as a disease area or as a therapeutic indication, and they've shown willingness to pay up for some of these technologies which look like neurogames or neurotechnologies. Now, I think the bar there is going to be awfully high, but ultimately, if that's the route you go, the FDA and eventually the reimbursed route, that is market making. So I think that we can expect to see that category of people set really standards for the time being. The bar will be very high, though.
I'd love to see insurers paying on efficacy. I think what we're seeing now, at least in our view, there are some self-insured organizations, some smaller insurers that are starting to cover things that maybe fall into the neurogame class. Our understanding is most of that coverage is more as an employee benefit, a perk, something that they know the employee wants, but they're not necessarily covering it or reimbursing it based on the fact that they believe it has a strong health impact or it's going to offset healthcare costs. But I don't think we're that far away from doing that. But we need the data and we need the interaction with that insurer community to start to communicate, no, this can be a real option. This can actually offset healthcare costs. You can think about this as any other thing in your formulary that you would cover purely for efficacy and financial reasons.
I can jump in here and just point out that the FDA also has a huge class which is called enforcement discretion, which means that if you're, and a lot of mobile apps fall under this, I mean, it's probably the biggest category. And what the FDA has said is you may have efficacy claims, even if they're around wellness, or they might be around some sort of disease or treatment, but there's such low issue about safety that they're just going to put it under enforcement discretion. That doesn't mean that it's not a medical device, and it doesn't mean that you don't have to adhere to good manufacturing practices and things like that, but it means that the FDA is not going to enforce their guidelines of going through class 1, class 2, class 3 validation and clearance or approval.
So when should a developer consider putting their product in front of the FDA and seeking FDA approval?
I think it's, so I think it's the intended use pretty clearly. So I think if you're going to use this as anything which supports the diagnosis, management, treatment of disease, and if you're going to look for a label that lets you market it as such, I think you're going to have to go in front of FDA because they're going to consider it to be a medical device. Having said that, as we all know, there are different ways to be regulated as a medical device. There's a relatively lighter touch way, which is pre-market notification. And there's a pre-market approval, which is basically something which looks very much like introducing a new medicine, where the standard of evidence is quite high. You have to do lots of clinical studies and so on and so forth. I think one of the issues for that former pathway, which people can speak to up here, the sponsors, is you've got to find a predicate technology. You've got to be substantially equivalent to something that's already out there in the marketplace. And I think it'll be very interesting in the coming years to see how neurogamers who elect to be categorized as a medical device, how effectively they are able to select their predicates.
Well, and you didn't say the key word for FDA, which is safety. That is the #1 priority of safety. So, for example, high profile 23andMe. Genetic testing has been out there for decades. And as long as it was telling you that, male, baldness was the consequence of the genetic testing, the FDA said, look, we're not, that's safe, we don't care. But as soon as technology advanced that you could get genetic information about some pretty some pretty advanced medical conditions, the FDA said, okay, now now it's crossed the line to we are not going to have it under enforcement discretion anymore. It's going to be regulated. And in our area of computerized cognitive testing, again, has been around for almost 2 decades. FDA has always put it under enforcement discretion, but then it started being used for concussion, PTSD, depression, and the FDA said, that's a safety concern. We are now going to enforce. So safety is the #1 consideration on whether you should go to the FDA. And safety as perceived by the culture, it's a subjective decision.
Yeah, and I think on safety, we are all starting to be, I think, a bit more sophisticated about what that means. Our first gut, maybe 3, 4, or 5 years ago, was these are safe. They're video games, right? Of course they're safe. Yes. So the thing you're putting in your hand at that moment, I think we all agree is generally safe. We can maybe talk about that in a little bit. But when you think a bit more sophisticated about, well, what's the clinical decision being made based on these data? What's the opportunity cost of using a product that could be a substitute therapy for depression? The opportunity cost is that person is not seeking other therapies possibly. And so there are safety ramifications that need to be considered, but it goes exactly back to what John said, which is the intended use.
Well, although I had an FDA person literally say to me, I don't care what your intended use is, I know it's going to be used for concussion diagnostic. So again, it's a cultural, and I had to convince them that that's not their job.
Yeah.
Their job is to look at my indications and make sure that my product is safe for my indications, which was as a thermometer, a diagnostic support tool for lots of conditions, including concussion.
And there's a gray area, though, that is worth bringing up, because you're absolutely right. That's crazy. They're not supposed to do that. It's government mandated that they, in fact, don't do that. But there is something in between the very clear what you state on your label as the intended use and what you mentioned, where they're regulating practice, which they're not supposed to do, which is it's not spelled out in words, but it's the implied intended use. And I think that's where this field needs to be careful, all of us up here and everyone who's developing something, to not go that direction. So we can say, all right, well, you know what, then I'm just going to make a product that on the label doesn't say for the treatment of ADHD, but in my marketing materials and in the subtext and on the pictures of my website of a doctor treating a child with ADHD and a Ritalin bottle falling off the counter because they're not using it anymore. It's kind of obvious what the intended use is, and
Exactly.
that they can regulate because it's your implied intended use, and that's very clear under medical device guidelines.
And I think one thing we haven't talked about, which is a learning from the experience of the consumer genetic world that the 23andMe is part of, is the fact that FDA will get very concerned, and I think the reason why the hammer came down on 23andMe ultimately is about reproducibility of the claim. So I think what they said there was, if you look at 23andMe and if you look at the next 3 or 4 people in the marketplace, and you send the same subject's spit test in to the 4 market leaders and say, what's my risk of developing Alzheimer's disease? If company A says it's 80%, if company B says it's 20%, if company C says it's 100%, and company D says it's 5%, then alarm bells go off. Because what it says is, whatever you're doing, whatever the proprietary piece of your diagnostic platform is, it clearly doesn't reproduce. And so what's the consumer to do if she sends off 4 tests in triplicates and gets these widely divergent responses? We're not quite there yet, because we're not answering these types of questions yet. But I think it's a concern that we all have, that once these headset technologies, let's say, to take an example, come out and start to be used as diagnostic platforms, it's very important that sponsor A comes up with more or less the same answer as sponsor B, for example, for your concussion risk from a potential TBI, or your autism risk or something. I think that to the extent that those numbers are divergent across approaches, there's going to be real concern, and the category is going to be looked at with great skepticism by the FDA.
Well, to the extent, I mean, the only modifier of that, and I wanted to hear what Ariel has to say, but the only modifier is to the extent that it's the same measurement that's being used across the different platforms. Because I think when you mentioned sponsors having all different things that can detect a concussion, some of our companies are trying to make things that are better than the competitors. Some of the companies have proprietary processing technologies that can possibly be a marker that's actually slightly different. So that's the only thing where, entrepreneurs and startups will get a bit into scary waters where we say we don't want to be compared with everyone else because we think we're better. And of course, we all think we're better in the entrepreneurial world, but sometimes we are.
You definitely are.
I was talking about you.
Thanks. So for us, a really important measure was doing studies ourselves with third parties, and we have over 50 of them currently running, folks like Mayo, et cetera, demonstrating efficacy of our tool. So although we haven't yet gone to an FDA level standard, I could not feel comfortable at night putting a product out that hadn't been validated by people who are seriously trustworthy and credible, and ensure that we've been building our technology with all of these players in the loop so that if the FDA does come in, all of us are in a great position to say, no, this is a verified, incredible space. We're doing verified, incredible things.
So as a developer, you have all these ways to measure the efficacy of your app or your headset. Like you can go the FDA route or you could do clinical tests. As a consumer, like if I'm just looking through an app store, if I'm just shopping for a headset, how do I know what actually works? Jason?
Thank you, Eddie. I think that's incredibly difficult at this point. I was thinking about your idea of tiers, especially in that tier 2 area. I think what we're going to find is that the difference between medical devices as they are today, as they're marketed, as they're sold, and what we're developing now is that we're going to have a wide variety of things in that middle tier that end users are going to be looking for before they necessarily seek some kind of credentialed advice about. And we're going to run into bottlenecks. I think we're going to see some interesting dynamics in terms of service use where a mother of a child with ADHD goes to a tier 2 service and thinks that this service is making claims that the service may not in fact be making, that a representative of them would say, we absolutely do not support the use of our product for that thing, but the consumer, of course, isn't going to reach out about that. Is going to be watching television or doing some Google searching, and is then going to sort of go to that product, try it out. It may or may not work, and then they're going to sort of be forming opinions, making conclusions, and then, of course, communicating with their friend groups, their peer groups, and sort of spreading that out. And so I think what PsyberGuide is trying to bring to this discussion is a forum where consumers can go, look at claims, compare products. We're trying to broaden our functionality to make that a little bit easier, but that service is really, really, really necessary, and it's going to be necessary going forward.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example. PsyberGuide's a great example of a trusted third-party curator of these technologies. And I'll just do a shout out for another one. SharpBrains just released a report yesterday, I think, that again is curating and looking at neurotechnology. So I think having those trusted third-party environments is a great resource for consumers.
Do you think these third-party guides are enough? Like, could you potentially see the market just being flooded with cyber games, like neurogames, and some of them are effective, but then the majority of them aren't, and then it just sort of like puts people off them?
I think that might happen. That might happen early on, but I think once a standard is inevitably set, that we're not going to. I don't think we're going to see that, because I think then. Once enough time goes by, consumers will at least be savvy enough to know what stamp am I looking for, what things do I need to see on a product to know that this is something safe. And so I think then that developers of new products will, I think, possibly even before they're marketed, are going to seek those out. So we may see some flooding at the beginning. I think we may be seeing some of that now in certain sectors, but I'm hopeful. I think as time goes on, particularly as third-party curators really get established and really make their way into the public consciousness, that I don't think that's going to be so much of a problem.
I think the hard part, though, is the curators, but I agree with you, and I think it needs to happen. I think it will happen. The hard part is to make the judgment and to go, there have been a couple groups out there trying to rate apps, right? And there are a handful, and some of them have folded. The hard part is when you start to go into the scientific realm, because obviously that's something that's very hard to automate, right, and very hard to make a checklist. And so you can go so far as, okay, does this thing function, meaning the device itself or the software itself function as it says it does? Is it developed under these types of specifications? That can be checkbox. As soon as it's like judgment call on the quality of the science, I think that's where, it's an area for great innovation. If we can figure out a way to have, innovative human or hopefully non-human ways to dive in and make judgment calls on the quality of science and the quality of the results and how well the results map to what's being claimed or what's being implicitly claimed. It's a hard problem, but technology solves hard problems. So.
One of the things that I'm here wearing two strange hats. One is Muse and one is Sareb. One of the things that we've looked at Sareb is building a certification standards, and that's probably coming about a year and a half down the road. And that's a panel that brings together experts in industry, BCI, et cetera, who can then look at apps as they come in and say, yes, these independent parties who understand the science, understand the space really well, can get an insight into what you've done and say, yes, this is verified. And that's one of the things that we're really working towards. I think on the other side, from a consumer's perspective, until that certification comes into place, you're going to see people trusting the big players and trusting people who are good actors. And if you are a good actor and working reasonably, then the developers on your platform also, it's our responsibility now as Muse to be good actors and ensure that the developers on our platform are good actors, and we promote the developers that are the good actors, and ourselves are really clear about what's acceptable and not acceptable. And then create trust in those ways.
An interesting approach to the issue that Eddie just brought up is obviously Apple and the health kit and the research kit that they just came out there. And you know that one of their 5 focus areas is actually movement disorders. And so what they're doing as somebody who sits very high up the value chain is they are enabling the collection of all kinds of mobile measurements of how people with movement disorders go about their daily, activities of daily living. And they're going to collect this and aggregate it and so on and so forth. They're partnering with Sage Bionetworks, who many of you may know is a great public-private enabler, and who I think has real credibility and who has got a really good track record around basically being a broker for this type of research and enabling a good pre-competitive or preclinical assessment of this type of technology, making it available in appropriate ways to third parties for additional scrutiny, for academic scholarship, for all kinds of things. And again, it's early days for that effort, but I think that's something, again, very focused on the therapeutic side of things. But if we're going to look for these neurotechnologies to enable the development and validation of, for example, new biomarkers to be used in therapeutic development and validation, I think it's going to come out of that type of effort.
Great, so I think we've got some time for questions. So if anyone, we've got one right at the front here.
Thank you. Question particularly to Ariel Garten. To your compliment, I was told that you have perhaps the largest brainwave database. And as the only representative of the headset manufacturers on the stage, I would like to hear how much you're willing to share that database and what is your effort or maybe your speculation on other headset manufacturers joining you. Basically, let the brainwave database be known to more people who might actually help with the development and research in this area. Thank you.
Sure. So for us, we think very much about how we can make brain data accessible so that A, everybody owns their own brain data, you can always access your brain data, and B, researchers and accredited third parties, because there's a lot of issues that we get into when we make brain data accessible because we still have to manage people's privacy, how we can make it accessible to accredited third parties to really do good work with it. That's a lot of what I think about.
Any more questions? One at the back over there, in the middle-ish.
Hello. Okay. I was wondering what you guys think about efficacy standards for things that are aimed more towards preventative medicine. So it seems like if you have a clinical disorder you're trying to treat, like ADHD, then it's sort of straightforward how to do the clinical trials, that's well established. But if you think that your product is more around wellness or helping you to prevent later disease, it's sort of unclear how do we even go about those trials or think about that. So I was wondering about your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that's an excellent question. I think first of all, you'd have to separate out claims about wellness and specific disease claims about prevention. I could see that being, I think, a very effective use of these products. Of course, the studies that need to be constructed in order to make those claims are particularly difficult and long, and they really do have to meet an even higher standard. But I'm excited to see that happen. I think it would be fantastic.
Yeah, I think it's a really important and interesting opportunity. I would absolutely agree that I think that to the extent that you frame those within a clinical outcomes kind of framework, an FDA appropriate framework, something that a doctor or a payer might look at with credibility, those are extraordinarily difficult studies to do. I mean, primary prevention, we'd all love to do that, for example, on Alzheimer's, but the scope and the capital requirements and the time requirements for something like that are just extraordinary. So I think that that category of data is probably, I would say, is going to be the last to be developed, that evidence base. I think we're going to see much more acute interventions or the support for those therapeutic interventions be validated a lot earlier, hopefully.
I agree. The FDA has, though, come down. They issued guidance just January this year, I think, where they said if you're actually tapping into a function that is supported in the literature to lead to general prevention of issues down the line. So exercise and cardiovascular effects, right? That's known in the literature, and you're just targeting exercise. That for even prevention claims on that you don't necessarily have to go the FDA path, and that won't come into play. But again, it's all that tipping point of, are you saying you're preventing myocardial infarctions in the next 5 years, or are you saying you're enhancing or preventing general wellness concerns down the line? That's, I think, where it tips. But they are I agree with you, they'll probably be the last to come because the big studies take a long time.
It also depends what type of data you're collecting. So, for example, you may, we talked earlier about predicates. The FDA may have cleared devices that have similar data to the data that you have, but used for totally different indications. And that could still be used as a predicate for your indications, which means you could do a fairly simple 510(k) application. So it really actually depends on the nature of the data.
That actually leads perfectly into my question in your last comment, and that is big pharma avoids FDA, even with infinite resources. They'll promote off-label, quote-unquote, off-label use. What about as a startup trying to gather data by relying on the physician's insurance and his patient client, his ability to request experimental use of our devices and our technologies in order to gather initial data, without having to go spend millions on we don't have as a startup to get, clinical data for our devices?
Well, I mean, I think that we need to remember there's a practice of medicine provision, right, that enables any physician to, assuming she or he is acting in good faith, to do whatever they can for the benefit and the health of their patients. So remember, physicians have extraordinary latitude just to begin with, independently FDA. FDA really comes in to address issues of how therapeutic products are marketed, right? So the individual physician can do whatever they want, right? And I think a lot of the technologies we're talking about at this meeting, because of their very favorable safety profile, are very appealing to physicians who would like to seek an option for helping their patients manage something or prevent something or do the rest. So I would say that the barrier for that is probably pretty low. But it assumes a physician who's engaged, who's on top of the literature, who has access to this product, and for whom the incentives to adopt the product and really disseminate it within their practice are there. You don't want a high-touch, complicated set of technologies that are going to be more headaches than they are use. So I think that that's kind of encouraging, and I think that the extent that physicians really start adopting this themselves and talking about it amongst themselves, that's a very interesting channel to get this stuff out there and to get it validated. As I said before, the real problem, I think, is a lot of physicians look to the guidance of their professional societies and look to say, what are the best practices that are coming down from on high, what's out there in the literature, what are the kind of, the very well thought through recommendations. And I think that, neurologists, psychiatrists, the rest have been sort of slow to embrace and endorse this stuff, although it doesn't mean it won't happen.
I think there's a big disconnect between clinical practice and regulation and payers. I think you mentioned payers as well. Payers don't check to see if what the physician used is the best practice or FDA cleared. Payers, pay what they've paid. I mean, they don't check to see if it's the best practice or FDA cleared. And physicians also don't necessarily look to see if what they're using is on-label, off-label, or cleared by FDA. So there's kind of a disconnect in those three things. So each startup really has to look at the whole life cycle to say, where is my time and money best spent?
The other thing from a startup perspective is I think that going directly to docs who are seeing patients and have sort of patients in the real world, I think is excellent and a path you should absolutely follow for feasibility testing and usability testing. But just to make clear, those generally will not be the types of relationships where you'll get your studies that give you definitive evidence, because those need to be run in a much different way. For a small scale feasibility of heterogeneous populations, it's a great path, but usually you'd still need well-designed and controlled studies to supplement that type of feasibility work.
Any more questions? One here?
Yeah, just in general in relation to the industry. When enough is enough? Meaning, do you need multi-center? Do you need replication studies? Meaning the question is, when enough is enough? My question was, in general, when enough is enough? Do you need multi-center? Do you need replication studies, meaning you have a good one single or a placebo, or what is needed in this specific industry?
I think that question goes back to standards.
Yeah.
So Jason's going to take it on first.
I think that's actually two questions, because I think the first one you have to answer when you're thinking is enough is when can you sleep at night thinking that you've put out a quality product? I think one of the specific challenges, but as well promises about the neurogaming, neurowearables, sort of e-mental health field is that there's a second step to that, which is when is enough to distinguish yourself from what may end up being a cloud of competitors. So I think standards play maybe the central role in that as a way to say to people that you want to buy your product, look at how we are the best. Look at what we can do for you. And look at these third-party or outside groups who are saying that when we say that we can be helpful to you in this way, that we mean that, and that you can rely on that. Yeah.
Well, and if you're talking about FDA regulation, when you go to the FDA with your claims, it's a conversation. I mean, so you shouldn't do a study and then go to the FDA and expect to get clearance. You need to go to the FDA with your product, with your indications, and negotiate. And it is a negotiation. In our case, it was a 2-year negotiation as to what is the right path for regulation and what is the data and the evidence that you need to support that. So, and it depends on the people that you talk to at the FDA. So if you get an answer you don't like, find someone else to talk to. We did that 3 or 4 times and, finally got what we wanted. But, it's a negotiation, it's a conversation. They're just people. And so I think there's no right answer because it's very subjective.
And I'd push that further out and say, whether you're a startup or anyone else, I mean, there's got to be a market out there for you to basically get a return on your investment, or your investors to, right? And to the extent that you're pursuing an FDA, a sort of a therapeutic market, that market is, one, physicians, right? Because they've got to be able to look at the evidence base and prescribe it, if that's what ends up happening. And 2, to the extent that you can't rely on a self-pay market, which I think you can't for a lot of these things, it's got to be payers. And I think for both those categories of people, the bar is currently, and it probably will for the foreseeable future, be very, very high. And if you look at things that look like neurotechnology, if you look at apps, if you look at light touch technologies that are being reimbursed out there, and you can look in diabetes, for example, for a couple of those examples of products that sit on your cell phone that are being reimbursed at somewhere between a premium pharmaceutical and generic, but that's a success story. The sponsors for those products had to do what essentially were clinical trials. It was as though they were developing a new medicine, right? So what they had to do was they had to go out and design good clinical trials. They had to do them at lots of different centers. They had to develop a very compelling evidence base for therapeutic impact of their approach in a well-defined clinical population. And that takes a whole lot of time and a whole lot of money. So I think that that may yet change. But I think if that type of evidence is really market making for a therapeutic product. And I think if you're developing that kind of product and starting now, I think you have to envisage crossing that threshold.
And I like the, sorry, go ahead.
I think also key to this particular industry is ensuring that you do a study that includes sham neurofeedback. So very often people will be delivering neurofeedback and see a significant, quote unquote, improvement in the patient's situation. But if you only delivered sham neurofeedback, you may actually discover a similar situation. So I've heard of people releasing studies with algorithms that make absolutely no sense to me. They've done it on a small population. The population has improved, not necessarily because the algorithm or the neurofeedback itself has led to that improvement. So we have to be really careful in our studies when we choose our controls, make sure that controls are effectively matched, and that you actually do something with a sham neurofeedback component and demonstrate that it's actually your intervention in your algorithm that's improving the situation.
And that's the type of thing where I was going with John's comment is that's the type of thing that when you go to the medical community and the average medical community, because we talk a lot about FDA, but I think FDA is something. But what we really want to target is, will healthcare practitioners, will the average doc be willing to prescribe this to their patient? And not the average doc that's a really early adopter and happens to live in San Francisco, because they're not your average doc nationwide. So one of the things they'll look for are controls. One of the things they'll look for are larger studies, not 10-person studies. One of the things they'll look for are, is this applicable to at least some breadth of my population? Meaning I treat patients from different areas and different socioeconomic classes. It doesn't mean you have to do 100,000 patient studies. It does mean that you need to think about what are they used to looking at when they're willing to recommend a path, whether it be a product or even a lifestyle change. What type of data are they willing to look at, or are they used to looking at to make that recommendation? Because that is a bar for a doctor. Doctors don't just recommend anything to patients. And so I like John's point and thinking about that as a target, as opposed to a specific standard or specific regulatory. We do the standards we need to for the path we're going down, but the target being who's your influencer channel that you're trying to go after.
And we're out of time now, so if you have any more questions, feel free to come up and speak with any of the panelists. Thank you so much for joining me on stage. You've been great.
Thank you, Tracey.
Thank you, Tracey.